Hello everyone, welcome back. So this video is about chapter 5 from the Helicopter Flying Handbook. As a reminder, as always, we're only going to cover things that are specific to helicopters, so anything that would be covered in Rod Machado's book, we are not going to cover again here. So rotorcraft flight manual, that's what this chapter is about. In an airplane, you have something similar called an AFM, an airplane flight manual. And if it's really old, at least for an airplane, you'll talk about a POH, Pilot's Operating Handbook. You know, what's the difference for an airplane if it was made before 1996? You could use a POH. If it was made after 96, then you had to have an aircraft flight manual. The difference between these two things, biggest difference is the flight manual is tied to a serial number aircraft, whereas the operating handbook is just generic. You know, it's not tied to a specific aircraft. And you don't necessarily even need it in your aircraft to fly. So the flight manuals that you're going to see for a helicopter or for an airplane have general sections that are organized in a specific way. So section 1 is always general information. It kind of gives you an overview of your aircraft. Section 2 will talk about limitations. What are the maximum speeds and things like that? You know, what are the instrument markings? What is your maximum never exceed speed? Now, for a lot of helicopters, the never exceed speed changes with the weather. So in the Schweitzer, for example, there's a little table in the cockpit, and with every flight, you can look and say, okay, what is my temperature? What's my altitude? And, oh, okay, so this is how fast I can go today. Now, if you really want to make that simpler, just take the doors off of the Schweitzer, because then it has a certain maximum speed that's below that normal speed. The Robinson's a little different. There's a little table that's in the manual that you have to look up before every flight, and it'll tell you what the different speeds are. You know, airplanes, honestly, the airspeed indicators are a little more complicated in airplanes because typically they will have, you know, a white arc for the flaps. We don't have flaps in a helicopter. You have the green arc, yellow arc, and then the red line. So in a helicopter, we're going to see something different. We might have a red line and a green arc. Sometimes you'll see things like this blue line tells you maximum auto rotation speed. You know, typically there's a minimum auto rotation speed, and that can vary based on things like weight. We already talked about the tacks and how there's typically coded ranges for the engine RPM and the rotor RPM. I mentioned in a previous video how the Robinson, the rotor RPM ranges are much tighter. In addition, if you exceed that rotor RPM, like if you hit above 108%, you're supposed to tear down the rotors. You're supposed to, you know, have them inspected for damage and all of that. Schweitzer, it's like, oh, did you overspeed that? Don't do that. There's no required inspection, though, if you do. So it's much easier to fly, especially for students. They talk a little bit about turbine gauges. I'm guessing most of you are not going to be flying that, at least not at first. And so here you're going to see things like, you know, this is the kind of placard you might see in something like the Schweitzer. where it's going to say, all right, here's your never exceed speed for different outside air temperatures and pressure altitudes. And if you take the doors off, then there's a different limit. Or you might see something more like this. It depends on the helicopter. Generally speaking, you'll notice, however, that as you go up, you can't go as fast. Other things you're going to see, emergency procedures, section 3, always. And it'll have checklists for, hey, what do you do if your engine fails in a hover? What if you are above 8 feet and less than 50 feet? What if you're above 50 feet? Or, you're high enough to do an auto rotation? Every manual is going to be a little bit different for what they tell you. That is actually one thing that I think Robinson does a little bit better than some of the others. Their manuals are pretty detailed. Then we have our normal procedures section and our performance section. So what is our in-ground effect hover? What is our out-of-ground effect hover? So I can say, all right, this is my weight, and it's 80 degrees outside. So according to this chart, it looks like I can hover in-ground effect at around 3,200 feet. Notice as it gets colder, let's say it's 0 Fahrenheit. Now, with that same situation, I can hover much higher, over 7,000 feet. Looks like about 7,500 feet is my in-ground effect hover ceiling. And my out-of-ground effect hover ceiling is going to be different. So it's not unusual to see two charts, one for in-ground effect, one for out-of-ground effect. And then you'll have your weight and balance section. Now, weight and balance is a little bit more complicated for a helicopter, and we'll talk more about that later. But for a helicopter, you don't just do front to back weight and balance. You also have to worry about the lateral weight and balance. And then we have section 7, which talks about different system descriptions. Section 8, how do you handle it, service it, and maintain it. And section 9 is any supplements. Then we have section 10, which is optional, really. It's safety and operational tips. Again, this is another place that Robinson does very well. They have a whole bunch of safety tips at the end of their manuals. And as time goes on, they just keep adding. Basically, somebody had an accident and they'll tell you about it. And they'll tell you what they think they could have done better and how you could avoid having that same accident. So that's a quick overview of the rotorcraft flight manuals and how they work. So I look forward to hearing your questions about this in our Q&A sessions in class, and we will see you then.